I believe we're good.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our statewide best practices session today. My name is Nancy Ruoff. I'm the Director of the Office of Accounts and Reports within the Department of Administration, and I welcome you to our Increased Delegated Purchase Authority Qualification Initiative meeting. We will have presentations today from both the Office of Accounts and Reports and the Office of Procurements and Contracts. Next slide, please. Just a few quick housekeeping reminders. We do have a large number of participants today, so we ask that you keep your lines muted and except for the interpreters to keep your cameras off in order to provide access to the bandwidth we need. Also, if you can please drop your questions in the chat. We do have staff online who will be responding to those throughout the session. And if there are some questions that we need to ask to the presenters, we will do that throughout the presentation. The questions and answers will be drafted as a follow-up resource and will be provided along with the slide deck and a recording of today's session. That will also be posted so that agencies can use it in the future for additional staff who may be new to the administration. Here's a quick view of today's agenda. I do want to let you know that we did send out a pre-session survey, and we thank you for all of your responses to that. The scope of today's session is going to be limited to the Increased Delegated Purchasing Authority, or the IDPA Qualification Initiative. There were items within the pre-survey that we will be targeting for future statewide training. So I wanted to make you aware of that. Two quick things I wanted to mention, however, are one was a request for video training options. I am excited to announce that the Department of Administration has obtained a video software that we can use to record and develop supplemental video training to go along with the existing job aids for Sharp and Smart. I can't give you any definite dates on that yet, as we are working with staff to get them trained up on that, and will then need to develop and roll those out in the future. We will be focusing and prioritizing based on the information that we have from agencies on where those would be most helpful. But we're excited to get that initiative started and move that forward. Secondly, we'll be talking today a little bit about the agency error rates. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a future slide, but that is a question that we will answer in terms of how those are calculated. We will be doing a quick walkthrough of the rec to check process, as we refer to it, and then we will be focusing on each of the areas that are areas of error rates that we have seen in the agency pre-audit process, and will allow us to focus on some training and some best practices and tips and tricks that will allow agencies to reduce those errors and allow us to be more accurate and compliant across the board. So for those of you who have not yet been introduced to the IDPA, agencies currently have a delegated purchasing authority, the majority of agencies, of $5,000 or below $5,000. So that means that any purchases that occur below $5,000 are the agency's responsibility, and those do not come through the pre-audit process at the central accounting area. The Secretary of Administration and the Office of Procurements and Contracts have identified that there is the authority to allow agencies to have an increased delegated purchasing authority of $10,000, $20,000, or $25,000. We have developed this program in alignment with them to ensure that as we allow agencies to increase that delegated purchasing authority, we maintain the compliance that we need and the accuracy we need to ensure that we're not increasing risk to the state of being non-compliant with purchasing statutes. So we have tied together the agency audit error rates as well as other risk-based metrics that will allow agencies to qualify for an increased delegated purchasing authority. As you can see from the chart here, the qualifying error rate, for example, for a $10,000 limit would be between 5 and 9%. For 20,000, it's 3 to 4%, and for 25,000, it's 0 to 2%. The number of documents of resolution for an agency to qualify is less than 3. And then we do review the number of issue papers during the evaluation period as well to ensure that that is not an area of risk. I will tell you that there are 17 agencies statewide who have already qualified based on these metrics and are being offered the opportunity to increase their delegated purchasing authority effective January 1. For the rest of us, including the Department of Administration, I'm sad to admit that we did not currently qualify under the metrics and are working through that process of improvement as well. We are in the middle of, or starting, the 6-month qualification period, which started on November 1st and will go to April 30th. And that qualifying period will allow agencies to work to
Nancy, you're muted. I don't know if you want.
This is Stacy. You've muted somehow. I'm not sure what has happened.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Where did I drop you?
When we were talking about the review period beginning,
Okay.
Yep,
Thank you.
The second chance review. I'm not sure what happened.
I'm not sure if somebody did a mute all. Okay, my apologies. So we have just entered the 6-month qualification period that started. It started on November 1st and will go through April 30th. And this is an opportunity for agencies during that period to look at and improve their processes to reduce their error rates in order to qualify for the increased delegated purchasing authority effective July 1st. The key agency benefits for qualifying include the increased spend authority, a reduction in prior authorizations, as well as a reduction in the need for bid events. Detailed information regarding your agency status was recently issued to the head of the agency, as well as the chief financial officer and the chief procurement officer. Those details will allow you at the agency level to look through and identify where your areas of biggest risk are and take action to be able to reduce those. Next slide, please. So just as a real brief review, you'll be able to review these in more detail, but I wanted to highlight, for example, what the difference is for an agency. So this, if your agency has a standard purchasing authority of $5,000, which right now the majority of us do, for payments between $5,000 and up to $10,000, the procurement authority belongs to OPC. You can see the prior authorization is required, and a bid solicitation, a formal bid solicitation or RFP process would be required for any payment that would be between $5,000 and up to $10,000. Next slide, please. When your agency qualifies for a $10,000 IDPA, that means that for those payments now between $5,000 and up to $10,000, the agency becomes the procurement authority for that transaction. There's no prior authorization required, and there would be no bid solicitation required as well. Again, if you go up to $25,000, you would have that same set of metrics change for those different levels. So there is great value to the agency, to the suppliers, and to us in the central office as well. This is truly a win-win process. Next slide, please. So here we are just showing you on a statewide basis where our biggest areas of audit error risk are. Prompt Payment Act is our largest area, followed by a tie between encumbrance violations and supporting documentation. Next is accounting errors, purchasing errors, and contracts. We are going to cover tips and tricks and best practices in each of these areas so that as you evaluate your agency error metrics, you can determine what best practices need to be put in place in order to bring your agency into compliance and qualify for the IDPA. There's really 4 C's that we've identified to the success of this process. One is culture. From top to bottom, rec to check, from the person who decides we need to have something to the person who gets that payment out the door, every person in that process needs to accept responsibility for ensuring the accuracy in each step of the process. Attention to detail is so important. Agencies need to have the appropriate internal controls by identifying and assigning key responsibilities, ensuring individuals with the responsibility are aware of and ensure that they have the knowledge that they need in order to be able to execute that. There should be appropriate backups in place, and approvers need to be aware of the fact that they're not meant to simply click and pass on the item in workflow, but that they have a role in the accuracy as well in ensuring that all of the appropriate documentation is there to support that transaction. Compliance. We are looking internally and have taken recommendations from all of you to improve our existing resources to ensure that staff have the knowledge and the training that's available and required to execute their responsibilities. And then communication. We definitely encourage a collaborative approach. We are working across 5 different offices within the Department of Administration in order to achieve success in this area, making sure that our handoffs and there's understanding between all of the areas that are responsible for this process. So really quickly, because many of you on this probably have a specific role in your agency and may not understand or know the full end-to-end process, we're going to walk through this so that you can understand and see where you fit in this process and what the responsibilities are and how you can benefit and support those across your agency. So for the requisition workflow, an agency staff identifies the goods and services that are ordered and identifies and verifies that funding is available for that. They may need to identify whether or not a statewide or an agency contract exists, if a prior authorization is needed, or what process and format will be used for that. That requisition is then entered into SMART. After identifying the appropriate purchasing authority, the funding should be identified and recorded as well, and the necessary supporting documentation should be added to that requisition. When that requisition receives the necessary agency, and if necessary, the Office of Procurement and Contracts approvals, it can then be sourced to a purchase order. It is really key at this point that the purchase order buyer confirm that the expenditure account code is accurate at the PO level, because that account code feeds to every voucher that will pay from that purchase order. That account code is responsible and used for both budgetary and financial reporting purposes. Once that is all done, the goods and services are ordered and we move on. When the agency receives those goods and services, there's someone who's responsible for reviewing the invoice, making sure that everything is accurate and compliant. It's very important that that invoice not only support the items that were received, but that it goes back and is reviewed against the quotes and the contract's pricing specifications that were made for the contract that was implemented for that requisition. That invoice is then forwarded to the appropriate accounting or delegated staff in the agency in order to create the payment voucher. Agencies, again, must ensure that the appropriate documentation exists, including the invoice and any other supporting documents for that voucher to be supported and to move through the process. I will tell you that our audit staff report that they on occasion receive a payment voucher for tens of thousands of dollars that does not even have any invoice attached to it or any supporting documentation, but has made it through 2 or 3 levels of approval, which indicates that that is being entered, but there's not the appropriate review occurring. Again, that voucher must include the appropriate expenditure code on all invoice lines, and that will be pulled from the PO. So it's critical that that be accurate there. The agency approver then pre-audits those payments, and those that are needed will and exceed the delegated authority will be pre-audited by the Department of Administration. The payment is then released to the supplier. At this point in time, I'm going to hand over to Stacy Jaramillo, who's going to start walking us through those specific areas of audit error rates and giving us best practices and tips and tricks. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nancy, and good morning, everyone. As you saw in our pie chart breakout, the Kansas Prompt Payment Act remains a significant challenge for state of Kansas payments at nearly 40% of our error makeup. So we've prioritized this piece in the training. We agree that with just a little bit of effort, the Prompt Payment Act, many of those items could likely be cleaned up. So let's start talking about what is the Prompt Payment Act. And lucky for you, I'm not going to read the state statute to you, but I did provide that citation there in case you do want some light reading on your own. Surprise, I'm running the slide deck and I need to tell myself to move forward, I suppose. In addition to the state statutes, Policy Manual 3102 will give you the specific details needed for the Prompt Payment Act. Again, I'm not going to read that to you today. In short, payments must be made to suppliers on or before the 30th calendar day after either we've received the goods or services or the bill was received by the agency. Now, I'm going to clarify here, that does not mean the bill was received by the agency fiscal staff, but the agency as a whole. So when did the state receive the bill for the goods or services? It is important to note that if there are no other indication of dates of invoice receive dates, the invoice date is what is used to compute the Prompt Payment Act. I think that's a piece of the Prompt Payment Act findings we're seeing. And I think that if we can illustrate when the invoice was received, that some of that would get cleaned up. Now, that's certainly not the case on all of them, and we're going to go through some examples of different things that audit sees on a regular basis. But if the invoice is date stamped, audit would be able to use that date stamp date. However, this is not the first time I'm going to say this. If audit identifies a large gap in between the invoice date and the date stamp, they will likely ask for additional supporting documentation to prove that there is a delay in that timestamp. If we see a pattern occur, we will probably take a look at a deeper dive in on the invoice receipt date situation. So that's my first warning, is to not pick up a date stamp and just start stamping everything the date you're processing it. Okay. Now, something else I'm going to mention when we talk about the Prompt Payment Act, the Prompt Payment Act is not a result of just fiscal staff in all cases. In some cases, it's possible, but this is possibly, in Office of Accounts and Reports, I'm going to throw us under the bus. I didn't warn Nancy I would do that, but we've ourselves held on to an invoice here or there because, again, I think the root of the issue is a lot of folks don't understand the requirements of this. In my 10 years with the state of Kansas, I've not heard much mention of this other than from an audit perspective where I've seen it. So we're going to try to highlight this for everyone to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Now, just a note, the Prompt Payment Act does not apply to goods or services provided by another agency. However, that does not mean we can get away with never reimbursing or paying our other state agencies. Okay. If you've not heard of the new policy manual, it was released several months ago. Policy Manual 11,969 discusses the expectations and requirements for interfund transactions for state agencies and does require that transactions be reciprocated within 30 days. So if you've not taken a look at that, go ahead and read through that at your leisure. Now let's talk about some examples. And here, I've had several conversations with agencies about when does the timestamp start and what can we do to ensure that we're not picking up Prompt Payment Act violations when it's out of our hands and out of our control. And so let's talk about some situations that I pulled from the from our error findings list and some of the solutions to some of these problems. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but just some options for you. So this payment was for Dell Marketing. It was approved from the agency on December 29th of 2023. The voucher included an invoice date of 6/10/2023. This was for, I believe it was for some computer monitors and similar hardware devices. Okay. So again, a commodity order. Now, if the goods and services were not yet received as of that 6/10/2023 date, the agency could do a handful of things. Request an updated invoice from the supplier, or provide a packing and shipping receipt that showed that those items were not yet received. I understand that both of those are theoretical and easier said than done sometimes. If you are consistently running into an issue with a supplier dating an invoice and not submitting it to you for a significant period of time, you would want to work with them to ensure that you're getting that dated properly. And if that's not going to work with your contract folks to ensure that we beef up language around invoices if we need to. Now, if the invoice wasn't yet received, but they dated it that 6/10 date, again, request an updated invoice from the supplier. Some suppliers would provide you that. I recognize some are reluctant to, or this is where that date and timestamp comes in, right? Again, if there's a significant time frame from invoice date to the date stamp time, audit may ask for additional supporting information. Somebody asked in the chat what could be used as proof. A lot of things, probably. If there's a portal or a website or something you're pulling the invoice from, or that it's made available, if you're getting an email notification that the invoice is available, something like that could work. Again, packing slips, things to that nature. So yeah, you can use a lot of different options to help prove that Prompt Payment Act, or sorry, that invoice or goods receipts. This next example speaks a little bit more to services. In this case, this was a payment to a software supplier, and I'm just going to make a note, the interpreters have handed off, so if you are pinning those, make sure you pin Jessica is the current interpreter. Just a moment to... Now, back to the software supplier. I did remove the name of the supplier to hide any possible guilty parties, but this payment in particular was presented to audit on January 3rd, 2024. The invoice was dated for November 1st for September 2023 services. Okay. Now, in this case, the invoice was stamped, received 11/20/2023. That would make sense if the invoice got dropped in the mail on 11/1. We can't control the United States Postal Service. And so in this case, that's great. However, January 3rd is beyond 30 days past that date stamped 11/20/2023. Now, in this case, the same, they did date stamp it. If the only other thing I can contemplate is if there was a dispute with the service, perhaps the agency did not receive what they needed in that service. Again, an updated invoice could be requested, or any other supporting documentation that would prove that that payment wasn't eligible to be made as of 11/20 when that invoice was received. Okay? Because it's important to remember the goods and or services must be accepted by the agency, in that they must be up to the agency's level of expectations and what the agency needed. So if we receive a box of broken monitors, we're certainly not going to make the payment that date, but we are going to hold the supplier to their end of the bargain. And they really should update the invoice date, because at that point, we do not owe them anything. And then this last one is related to a one-off service. It's preventative maintenance service. With this one happened to be P1 Construction. The payment was submitted on June 18th, 2024. Again, for preventative maintenance at various agency locations. The invoice is dated December 29th, 2023, and included work that was completed in October and November of 2023. So in this case, audit is going to look at this and say the services were received and completed in November. The invoice is dated December 29th. So the December 29th becomes the start, and that the payment was not completed until June 18th. Okay. Again, we go back to if the service was not complete or acceptable, then supporting information should be provided, or the invoice should be updated by the supplier. And again, if that invoice hadn't been received in December, and wasn't received until closer to June, a date stamp could be considered. Now, if we show up, this is where, again, if that date stamp has a long delay from the invoice date, some additional information, it would be prudent to provide additional information up front with the payment, so that way you can fully support that this wasn't in fact a prompt payment violation. So recap a handful of best practices to remember when it comes to Prompt Payment Act. Prompt Payment Act on the surface is simple, but it requires all agency staff to understand the requirements and responsibilities that they have to ensure we have compliance with the Prompt Payment Act. Again, this isn't our policy. This is a state statute. And so the state expects our payments to be made timely. So again, training all staff the requirements of that Prompt Payment Act, ensuring that those that were unable to attend today are caught up on the key notes from this piece. Again, they may not necessarily be the purchasing staff or the fiscal staff. I would go out on a limb and say those folks know the rules of the Prompt Payment Act. This might be the person in the field that's able to call for maintenance or call and order computer monitors. They must understand their responsibility and expectations. Developing a written internal agency policy and procedures for invoice receipts and approval expectations. The approval delay that could happen in an agency does not provide additional days to the prompt payments calculator, if you will, that countdown, that 30-day countdown. So it's important to provide those expectations. For example, if John receives the computer monitors, John has whatever appropriate amount of time of days, 5 days, to double check and confirm those computer monitors are acceptable, and then to confirm the receipt that the invoice is appropriate and in line with the contract requirements, and then approve it and pass it on to the next level of approval. Okay. If your agency struggled significantly with Prompt Payment Act violations, if that's a large part of your pie chart, take a look at your internal processes to see if there is a bottleneck or if there are ways to streamline, which brings us to streamlining. Review your processes to see if an approval process like using DocuSign or a similar program would help parallel approvals or set up a cadence of approvals. So there are opportunities to create such a thing. Establishing centralized mailboxes to avoid unmonitored emails will be extremely helpful. In a lot of instances, I've heard feedback that, oh, I know where we got that Prompt Payment Act finding. It was because somebody left the agency or somebody was out for an extended period of time unexpectedly. So there are opportunities for invoices to go to unmanned inboxes, if you will. If that is something you've experienced, start to consider, or even if you've not experienced it, this is your warning. Create a centralized mailbox for invoices to go into, and that could be department, and every agency is going to be a little bit different. So consider that. And then certainly with that policy and streamlining, confirming backup duties are assigned for when you have absences. Ensure that those backup duties are set out and folks understand that when they're supposed to be the backup. So that way, again, the invoice isn't dropped. And then again, we go back to document, and we're going to talk a little bit more about documentation later as well, but work with the supplier to receive adequate invoices. If you have a specific supplier that is consistently dating the invoice but not providing it to you, again, work with them or your procurement office to hold them to their end of the bargain, okay, their end of the deal. And again, date and timestamps when date and timestamp an invoice when it's received by the agency. And there is a question about, when I say a date and timestamp, that can be a physical stamp that you've ordered with the little date change opportunity. You could document that in PDF if you are receiving the invoice electronically. No need to print it out, just so you can go stamp it with a date timestamp. If you're receiving it electronically, you could also just provide the email that comes with it. So there are a lot of different ways, and like I said, I didn't intend to have an all-inclusive list, but just to start, working through your thought process and what invoice receipt looks like in your lane. Okay. So now we're going to move a little bit into the encumbrance and fiscal year determination before we hand it over to the Office of Procurement and Contracts for a solid contract review and topics in that nature. So encumbrances and fiscal year determination, these two policy manuals, and again, surprise, I'm not going to read them to you. You're welcome. But these policies go very much in tandem with each other. They each have their own components, but they should be utilized together. It's important to know both of them. If you're not the purchasing person, the requisition person, the fiscal person, it's still important to understand overall the expectations of encumbrance policy and the importance of fiscal year determination. Okay. So if you've never heard the word encumbrance, what is it? This, and I'll let you know, encumbrances are a struggle probably nationwide, just as far as what does this mean and how does this play? But overall, this is the vehicle that reserves funds to pay obligations created in a fiscal year by the agency. Okay, it's essentially, writing a check and carving it out in your checkbook ledger, your register, and holding that until the goods or services are complete, and then handing it over to be cashed. Okay, so it's just carving out what we've obligated, and it's just how we do it in the system. So those can look like purchase orders, travel authorizations, or GL encumbrances. Okay, each of those have their own sets of rules and different things. And again, we're not going to get into the weeds of that, but that's what they look like. Now, fiscal year determination, it's an accounting principle and a budget principle that would require expenditures to be matched in the appropriate budget year. If you are appropriated a certain amount of money in a fiscal year and you create services or order commodities in that fiscal year, the expenditure should be tied to that fiscal year. Okay. So let's drill in a little bit deeper. Obligations are required to be encumbered in SMART no later than the service date or the order date. Okay, that's again, that just drills down to the policy. And this is a piece that should be communicated agency-wide. For anybody that's allowed to walk out and order or purchase something on the agency's behalf, they must understand that encumbrance should be in place before we commit with the supplier on, yes, I would like that box of widgets. Okay. If the service or order date occur before the requisition is entered into SMART, that's where we experience the audit finding. Okay, so if your agency struggled with encumbrances, it's likely that we saw services or order dates coming in before the requisition was entered into SMART. Okay, now just a note, agencies are given time in the month of July for new fiscal year expenses. So for those July expenses that are being incurred, there is sufficient time and findings aren't issued then. If you have a July 2nd service, the system likely isn't even open yet on July 2nd for that encumbrance to be created. So creating that encumbrance after the fact will not incur in a finding for July expenses. Okay. Now, what is required to be encumbered? Merely all operating expenses. Okay, it's important to note that if this is a regular operating expenditure of your agency, and again, this is a piece that should be communicated to your agency staff, especially if they are authorized to make purchases on behalf of your agency. Okay, so it's whether it's over or under the delegated purchase authority, is on or off statewide or agency contracts, or does not require a prior authorization. Now I'll let you know there are some exceptions to the encumbrance policy, and you can find those in the policy manual. We're not really going to talk about those today because those didn't lead to the findings that we're experiencing. Okay, so again, it's just a good process to get your brain wrapped around. Some other things, oddball things, if you will, that are required to be encumbered. Credit card purchases, your P card purchases, when we're using a statewide or agency contract, or when a prior authorization is required, that item must be pre-encumbered. Now, I will just drop a quick note here. Agencies that are entering into the IDPA, that increased delegated authority, have an expectation to create a purchase order with all of their P card spend. It doesn't necessarily have to be the pre-encumbrance, but we do want that spend detailed to be captured on all P card lines. So that's another time, but just a note about that. Travel authorizations paid through the travel and expense module. It's important to note that those may need to be encumbered if they're out of state and international travel events, or if they may not be reimbursed in the year that the employee traveled. Okay. And then lastly, an important note I'm going to make here, because this note does lead to findings that we see on a regular basis, especially around that fiscal year timeframe. Obligations that are chargeable to prior fiscal year funds, but would not be paid during that prior year, even if they're not generally required to be encumbered, must have an encumbrance to capture the funds. Okay, so for example, utilities are not traditionally required to be encumbered. However, if the service is for the month of June, and the payment or the invoice or the service date cuts off June 20th, the agency doesn't receive that invoice until July.
Learning Center, this is Chris.
Yeah, if the agency doesn't receive that payment that invoice until July 5th, but that service was it from the prior year. So an encumbrance in that case would be necessary to ensure that we spent the correct year funds on it. Okay, so we as we near the end of the fiscal year, we can have more discussions related to what to do in spaces of that. But just note that as we near that, you may need additional encumbrances. So this is your not annual reminder, your mid-year reminder. Encumbrances must be reviewed regularly as a matter of best practice, probably monthly, to ensure that several things. One, that unliquidated encumbrances have been met or paid, that all obligations have been met and or paid. If you have encumbrances that must remain open for 3 years or more, you must fill out the appropriate documentation, have it appropriately approved, and then provided to the Office of Accounts and Reports to ensure that old encumbrances are not closed. Okay. Now, a few best practices, and again, certainly not inclusive. There may be more. And I'm going to take just a moment. Our interpreters are handing off again. Okay, so encumbrance best practices. Recurring or annual obligations could be set up at the beginning of the fiscal year. Some agencies will create encumbrances for each of those 12 monthly payments, but it could also, if it's reasonable for your agency, it could be set up as a singular encumbrance and subsequent payments made from the one encumbrance. That could be a time savings for you. Now, in situations like this, and then all other encumbrances, as the fiscal year moves on, encumbrances should be reviewed to ensure that the proper balances are available. If the agency identifies a situation where the encumbrance will be short and will not cover the final fiscal year payments, change orders can be completed to increase that encumbrance. Now, just a couple of notes, and very important notes, that encumbrances, if a change order is completed to increase a purchase order, that increase is also subject to purchase authority rules. For example, you may need a revised prior authorization or possibly an amended contract. So it's very important to keep an eye on and monitor the spend allowance there as well. So it's not just ensuring the purchase order can absorb the payments, but that increase in purchase order is authorized for spend. Okay. Now, I will note that we've identified a little bit of a gap in our training documents, and the SMART team has been working on creating additional guidance related to that. And there may be a link out there. We will provide that when we provide all of the follow-up resources. Now, encumbrances and reporting month-end checklists, there are several out there. I'm not going to list them all. You can utilize the different month-end checklists to provide the different reporting tools that are useful to you. But one I will highlight is the purchase order may close report. This is going to show the purchase order line amounts, invoice amounts, and then any uninvoiced amounts. So what is left and available in that purchase order. There is a question. There are a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to try to address them quickly. But folks, one thing we do intend to do is download the chat questions, provide additional information that we maybe weren't able to cover thoroughly, and provide that also as a resource and a follow-up resource to this call. So a question about encumbering emergency or weekend purchases. If it is truly an emergency purchase, that the building is flooding and we've got to get somebody out to take care of it, certainly address the problem, address the emergency, and then as soon as possible, the encumbrance should be plugged in. Now, in those cases, you will want to make sure it's extremely clear in the payment, in the payment vehicles, the vouchers, the TOs, that this was related to an emergency. And also, I'm going to caution, if you don't start to call everything an emergency to circumvent audit. And also, another issue we've seen in the past is if it is an emergency, ensure that staff know to get the information to the appropriate people immediately or as soon as possible. We would expect that the encumbrance or the purchase order to be plugged in within a business day or two in an emergency situation. So we would have a little bit of a grace period there. I don't have a timeline on that. It depends on reasonableness of the situation. But we do not expect to see the encumbrance created a month later. If it is created a month later, that will likely result in an encumbrance violation. Okay.
Stacy, this is Nancy. I did just want to say that I believe in the past as well, the Office of Procurement and Contracts have asked that just at least an email be sent to them to notify them of that emergency or weekend purchase, and that can be used as documentation as well.
Yes, thank you. And that's an excellent point. Now, folks, I do want to answer more of the questions in the chat, but I'm concerned about time. So if time allows at the end, we may be able to go back and pick up. Otherwise, like we said, we intend to provide a question and answer sheet with a detailed information to your questions. So do ask them, even if we've already covered the topic, and we will get to them at some point. So let's move to fiscal year determination. And for those of you that are new to the fiscal policies of the state of Kansas, the fiscal year begins on July 1st and closes on June 30th of the following year. Now, agency obligations, again, I mentioned this earlier, must be encumbered in SMART in the fiscal year or for the fiscal year in which they will take place. I'm not going to go through every detail of the policy manual, but I do encourage you to read it. I encourage your staff, those that are responsible for ordering or making these, creating the requisitions in SMART, to understand the details of this policy manual. Now, fiscal year for commodities is determined by the date of the order. So the date the order is placed. It does not matter. It includes items, so it doesn't matter if an item is on back order and would not received until a following fiscal year. And on occasion, we've had agencies cancel the purchase order from when they created the order and create a new one in the year that the order was received. But the proper way to do that is to leave the purchase order open, and when the good or commodity is received, make the payment from that prior year purchase order. Okay, we experienced this a lot around vehicles, from specifically around the COVID timeframe, when supply chain issues were a big challenge to the state and everybody else. But in this case, let's suggest a vehicle was ordered in March of 2024, which is fiscal year 24, and the purchase was encumbered correctly in that same fiscal year. The payment would be made from that encumbrance, regardless of when the vehicle is actually received. It could be received in the following year or beyond. Okay, so that's how commodities should work. Now, maintenance and ongoing services, and again, I know you might ask, what if, because you see the oddball situations. If you run into something like that, please ask it to the appropriate groups so we can give some guidance and feedback on where that should be assigned. But let's talk, like I said, about maintenance and ongoing service. The fiscal year in this case is determined by the commencement or the beginning date of the period covered by the payment. So, for example, a maintenance period, a 12-month maintenance period that runs from August 14th of 24, which is fiscal year 25, through August 13th of 2025, which is fiscal year 26. So this encumbrance and payment should be made in SMART from fiscal year 25. We would expect the encumbrance to be created prior to the August 14th date, so that way both policies could be satisfied, or both sets of rules could be satisfied. Now, when we talk about other services, things that are not ongoing or, long-term services, just a supplier came out to repair something, this payment is charged to the fiscal year in which the work was completed. Okay. So again, this is discussing, like an on-call maintenance needed for a building repair, not related to a project or an ongoing, anything related to that, but just we had a break in something and we had the service repair come out in June of 2025. All of the work was completed in June, but the invoice wasn't received until July of 25, which is fiscal year 26. That encumbrance and payment should be charged in SMART to fiscal year 2025. Okay, so we would need to have that encumbrance created prior to the repair person coming out and completing that work. Now, capital outlay and projects get a little bit unique, and agencies are given quite a bit of discretion on what is appropriate to pay the projects. It may be encumbered based on the beginning date of the project, but could also be encumbered annually as appropriations or budgets are available. Okay, so again, agencies have some discretion. But in an example, an improvement project is approved to begin in FY25. The full project could be, and that should say could instead of should, could be booked to FY25 and managed as a project by the agency. Now, one indicator to note here is that the payment records in SMART would include or should include a unique identifier for this project and recorded throughout. Okay. And thank you. And folks, that PO month-end checklist and training page has been pinned in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Again, if we have time at the end, we may be able to go back and pick up questions. But we have a lot of really great information. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to cover it. Kelly Johnson from the Office of Procurement and Contracts. I think that lets you go ahead and kick off.
All right. Well, thank you, Stacy. Good information. I learn each time we do this. So, hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Johnson, Deputy Director of IT and Technology for the Office of Procurement and Contracts. And we're going to go over a few common issues that we have seen that create some problems for agencies and subsequently could impact your IDPA. And so the very first one of these is going to be what's called a DOR, or Document of Resolution. And before I jump into this, I did see that Josh had a question regarding the DORs, so this kind of fits in with his presentation. Regarding the IDPA, any agency that receives 3 or more document of resolutions, from here on out, I'll just call them DORs. Any agency that receives 3 or more DORs will not be eligible for a increased delegated purchasing. And Josh asked, was there any concept of requiring or adjusting this limit of 3 depending on the size of the agency? And the answer is yes, Josh. But what we decided to do at the end, we did not want to make it so small for agencies that only have a few transactions. I mean, if we adjusted this to where the larger agencies were at 3, then the smaller agencies may only get 1 shot or so. So we just left it at 3 for consistency on everyone. And that way we weren't, unfairly dinging the small agencies. So what is a DOR? Because a DOR is a document that is issued by OPC or audit when we see a purchase that did not conform to the requirements. Now, the most common factors for this are listed on the right there. Contract numbers not being referenced or being referenced incorrectly. So, for example, if you had a prior authorization that you are sending through, but also included a contract. In a case such as that, what you're looking at is there'd be a DOR because there should not be a contract on a prior auth, or if the contract is applicable, there should not be a prior auth. So there's an issue there. Also, and that kind of falls into number 2, the most common by a long shot is agencies that exceed their delegated purchasing authority. So as Nancy mentioned in the opening, most agencies are currently sitting at $5,000 per vendor per year. So in this case, you can have an agency procure goods or services from a vendor in the amount of, let's say, $3,500. They will not need a prior authorization for that. However, if 6 months later they go to buy another $4,000 from this vendor, then the cumulative spend with that vendor from that agency would be $7,500, thus exceeding their delegated authority of $5,000. So in a case like that, the agency, even though the second purchase is still less than their delegated authority for that single transaction, the cumulative spend was not considered. If that went through, audit will catch that and a DOR will be issued. Just for note, in a case such as that, the agency should send through a prior authorization for the full amount for $7,500, and then note that they'd had previous spend of $3,500 earlier. Doors can be issued also in the event that an agency has incorrectly used a contract or failed to adhere to the terms of the contract. And we're going to go through those in greater detail here in a few slides. I do want to, and Stacy, if you want to jump to the next slide, please. As we start going through contracts, I do realize that this audience is very mixed. So there will be people that are very familiar with the concepts that I am giving you here. However, we wanted to make sure that all of these slides were available to you to give to your people and to make sure. So when we start looking at contracts, state of Kansas contracts, please understand that a contract is issued generally as the result of some sort of bid event. They can also be issued as the result of a prior authorization from an agency. Those are known as agency contracts. And we'll also talk briefly about contracts that come around as part of the cooperative purchasing. So when we start looking at contracts, we really want you guys to take a look at several factors on these. And one of the issues that we see commonly is a vendor charging an amount that is different than what is said on the contract. This is a very common occurrence, and we have some that are even currently going on where a vendor is charging freight and the contract does not allow for it. So in those cases, I urge you to work with the Office of Procurement and Contracts. On the contract, as we will see, the procurement officer's name is listed, so you are able to reach out to them to discuss specific terms. If a vendor is attempting to charge a different price, we'll look and you can see where the pricing is on the contract and hold the vendor accountable. So do not allow a vendor to modify what they're charging apart from what's on the contract without talking to OPC first. Okay, and equally, not all contracts are eligible for P-card purchases. So that will be listed on the contract. And always, before attempting to service or to purchase goods, make sure those goods are not available on state use vendors. You really want to keep an eye on to make sure that you're using state use vendors first, even if duplicate products are available from vendors. So when you're looking through the contract, there's several things that we're going to go over here. But number one, is this contract available to my agency? Just because a contract is listed on eSupplier does not mean it's available to everyone. Number two, what commodities and services does a specific contract cover? This one's very important, and you start looking, a lot of vendors will have multiple contracts with the state. And so, for example, Dell has a contract for computers. They also have a contract for leasing. You want to make sure that the contract you are referencing covers the service or goods that you're intending to procure. Again, going back to the door, this is one of the issues that we see. People just see the name of the vendor and pick the contract without reading it. We've already talked a little bit about pricing. There are also some contracts that require you to get multiple quotes. And again, depending on the type of the contract, it's very, very important to read the contract and to look at the specifications section which we'll be looking at here in just a moment. But some of them, if you go over a certain dollar amount, you have to get multiple quotes from multiple vendors. And again, this will tie right into the purchasing limit. Okay. And so next slide, please, Stacy. This is a page which may or may not be familiar to you guys, but this is our e-supplier page. Okay, we changed interpreters, so I'm going to give everyone just a moment here to make sure you've got them pinned. All right. On the e-supplier page here, this page is available from the OPC website. And if you go to our website, there's actually a big button there that says e-supplier. Just click on that and it's going to bring you to this page here. There's several things that you can do on this page. Just a couple I want to point out. On the top right is registration. That is for your bidders, pardon me, or I'm sorry, your vendors. If you have a vendor that wants to participate, you can send them there for information. You can send them to OPC and we can give them information. But that's really for the vendors up on the top right. Bottom left is the square for public bidding events. This bidding events, those are in-process bids, whether they be RFPs, RFQs, IFBs. Any of our bidding events that OPC is running are in that area. And the one that we're going to look at the most here is the one that says contract search. So next slide, please, Stacy. This here is what causes a lot of people heartburn. And I want you to note in the top center, if you're opening a contract, and we'll be giving you the steps here shortly, but if you're opening it and it looks like writing from Mars, it's more than likely these steps have not been followed. The system stores these documents in a format called XML, which is just a computer term for a special type of file. These are not open natively by Windows machines. So you click on that area. You'll notice on the far left, the word instructions is blue. You just click on that area and it will then load a document that most users can walk through that. It's only a couple steps. If you have issues, and we have had people with issues, don't hesitate to give those instructions to your IT staff and get them involved. Once this is done, generally it's done forever. Okay, next slide, please, Stacy. Okay, as again, the contract search, we can kind of skip past that one, Stacy. When you click on that, this is the screen that you're going to see. As I noted in red there on the bottom, we also have those same XML instructions located at the bottom of this page. So if you missed it previous, you can just get them from here. But there's several fields here that you're able to start doing a search on. And go ahead, Stacy, to the next one. They'll have the highlights. These are the most common fields. Of course, you can use any of the fields that you want, but the keyword search, if you know the name of a vendor or a type of product, as long as it appears in the title or the supplier name field, keyword search will help you bring up those contracts. If you want to know all contracts from just a given supplier, key their name in under supplier name. And if you know the contract number, which is even better, you can key it in the contract number field. You can also get much more granular if you want. You can key in, put in 2 or 3 of these field names at once. The red arrow is pointing to a box there that says include expired contracts. By default, this screen will not bring up any contract that has expired. So if you remember, hey, I knew contract 1, 2, 3, 4, and I looked at it 6 months ago and it's not showing up now, you can click that checkbox, do another search, and if the contract has been allowed to expire, it will then show up. Other fields that are sometimes handy if you want to see contracts that are just available to your agency, you can, of course, key in your agency name there. If you want to make sure it's exactly as the system sees it, use the little hourglass off to the right and it'll list all agencies. Okay, so now you key in some sort of information, and let's say you just keyed in the word Dell under supplier. Stacy, if you'll jump to the next one, please. If you look here, you'll notice the word Dell appears in various fields. So, of course, the very first one is Dell Financial Services. But if you look in line 3, that brought up Good Dell. So you'll notice that lines 3 and 4 have nothing to do with computer company Dell, but that name appeared as part of the supplier. This shows you that you can search on partial name matches. So in the event that you need to do a search for, just DEL, you can key that in as well, and it will bring you up a whole lot more. So in this case, there's several things that this screen, even without going into the contract, will show you. Obviously, the first thing being the contract number, which is the most key field, but then it also brings you up a title. Now, the title should give you a general, and please allow me to stress the word general, idea of what this contract is about. That does not, please do not use that to select your contract, but use that to eliminate invalid contracts. It'll tell you the supplier, when the contract will expire, or in the event you'd click that previous screen, the expired contracts, it will show you when it did expire. Equally, it'll show you what type of contract, agency or statewide, if it's available to political subdivisions, being cities, counties, etc. And then off on the far right is a little word called attachments, which is in some ways a little bit misleading because this is going to take you not only to the attachments, but also to the contract. So if you want to go to the next slide, we're pretending like we clicked on attachments, and it's now bringing up this contract. Actually, it's not the one that was highlighted. This is another statewide contract. And when you look at this one, if you look at this one, there's 2 sets of attachments. Several things I want you to note. Again, at the top, the contract number. Number 2, the contract type. So in this case, it is statewide, means it's available to any state agency. You can verify the supplier's correct and the start and end date. At this point in time, you're going to see 2 different things. Number 1, the master contract. That is the contract that kind of started this thing off, whether it be from a cooperative or a bid event, and any subsequent amendments. And amendments can be change of pricing, change of terms, change of vendor name. I mean, anything that changed on this contract is going to show under an amendment. And so the primary one that most everyone's concerned about, obviously, is the main contract. So if you actually click on the attachment, and then Stacy, can we go to the next one? There's several things when you click on that you really want to be looking for. And if there's nothing else out of this, please note the different parts of a contract. For procurement professionals, this is your most key critical part, and where we see the door issues come up, etc. All contracts that are bid should have these parts. Number one, a header page. Number two, terms and conditions of that contract. Number three, specifications. Number four, pricing. And then number five, every contract should include the DA 146A. Now, there can be more than this, but for anything that has been bid, you will see this. Agency contracts and cooperatives are slightly different, but let's just focus on these for now. Okay, can we jump to the next one? And this is pretty much if you would have clicked on that contract document and XML is working correctly, you're going to be able to double click on that document and it's going to open in Word. And this should be the very first thing that greets you. And this part here will help you understand more about this contract. The very first field, and I mean, everything on here is important, but these are the fields that we're most commonly asked about. Number one, who is the procurement officer? Who, if I have a question on this contract, who in OPC can I contact? In this case, this contract's mine. You jump down, and then my information is right there, my email address and phone number. What specifically is this contract for? Well, it's for Dell computer equipment. It's statewide contract, and once again, there's the period of contract. You can also get down a little further, and this particular contract has 2 vendor contacts. So if you start looking at, if you have questions on the contract itself, you would reach out to Mike Vita at that information. But if you're looking for sales, you would reach out to Todd Kellner at that information. So again, this very start of the form. So if you're wanting to use this contract and you don't know what's available, you could reach out to myself, or I may send you over to the vendor sales contact just to make sure. Okay, one more click, please, Stacy. So this particular contract, I wanted to note, you will see that this is a NASPO contract. So when we start talking about cooperative contracts later, this particular contract would not have a lot of details to it, but those details can be found under the event ID. In this case, if you look up this contract, you can click on that. It's a clickable link, and it will take you to the NASPO site with all the documentation, what this covers, what the terms are, etc. So we generally, when we're doing cooperative agreements, a lot of the information that was previously discussed is not in our contract, but refers back to the co-op. You'll be able to click on this and get that information. Okay.
This is Nancy. Since
Hi,
we're
Nan.
speaking about NASPO, there was a question that was raised. How does one verify pricing when the contract stipulates pricing is 10% below market prices? They said they see that pricing a lot in NASPO contracts.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. I did not see that one. I appreciate it. A couple ways. A lot of those contracts, the majority of them, if you follow that link, there will be a pricing form. So you click on this, it's going to take you to the NASPO page. In the bottom right, it's going to have a series of documents, including the contract, etc. Usually, there's a pricing document at that point in time. If there is not, and by the way, so that pricing document, generally your price will be 10% off of that. If there is not, then what you're going to do is to see how you can find their standard pricing, whether it be via website, whether it be emailing the contact and saying, okay, what is our price and what's your standard list price? We try to have fixed prices where we can, but some commodities are so volatile that the pricing changes almost daily. So in those cases, that's where you get in touch, like in this, for this contract, with Todd and say, get me up-to-date price. If you want verification, they should show you what their list price is, and then their quote should show the 10% discount. Okay. And if there's more questions on that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And so me and my team handle all the cooperative agreements. So reach out to myself or a member of my team and we will help you. Okay, jump into the next slide, please. The first thing, please understand on the contracts as they exist today is almost the first thing, the first section in any contract is the state standard terms and conditions. As you'll notice, the little cutout here, this is on page 2. So page 1 was those event details, terms and conditions, starts page 2. Almost always, these are pretty much standard. They fall into every contract. However, please do not make that assumption because one of the areas that changes quite often is pricing. And so when you start looking at pricing, as we mentioned before, you will actually, there's a section in here, it's about 2/3 of the way through that has a term for pricing. And it's going to have generally 1 or 2 considerations: fixed pricing throughout the life of the contract, or the ability to jump up 5% annually. And we can talk about that later, but I don't want to spend too much time on it now. So section 1 of the contract right now is your terms and conditions. If you have specific questions on those terms, read through those just to make sure nothing odd or unusual has been negotiated. This is the appropriate time for us to mention OPC is working on changing the order of these sections. And so right now, what you're going to see is generally you see your terms first, you see your specs, then you see your pricing. We're moving to where your specifications will be the very first thing you see in a contract. Unless it's a task order, then task order will appear first. But your specifications will determine exactly what the contract's for. In fact, if you want to, Stacy, we can jump to the next slide, please. Currently, this is in section 2 of the contracts. This will be moving to section 1 in the near future. Now, we are not going to go back and retroactively change every contract. This will be on a go-forward basis. So it's still important to be able to find these specifications in existing documents, but we're attempting to make it easier to understand what a contract is for. Your specifications are exactly that. It will tell you what the contract is for. So for example, in this particular contract that we're looking at, the scope will determine what it's for. And it says to establish a statewide contract for agencies to use to purchase new equipment or repair parts or to obtain service for security systems. So in this particular case, you know that this is for security systems. It is not for an oil change. So it will tell you exactly what the contract is for. And this section, although I just cut the very beginning, these sections can get very, very lengthy. And this is generally created from your bid event. So when you send OPC your specifications, we're going to take that. We're going to, work with you to make sure they're clear. But at the end of the day, your bid specifications will flow through to a contract. This is where that appears. So when you find that OPC is overly picky on your specs, this is why. We want to make sure that you are able to get exactly what you want, because if your specs are not clear, neither will be the contract. So currently, specifications is in section 2. Section 3, and we're changing interpreters. So I'm assuming by now everyone's got everyone pinned. So in section 3, generally, this is your costing sheet. Now, again, please bear in mind, there can be additional sections. So, 1, 2, and 3 does not always appear as 1, 2, and 3, but they will appear in the contract. So there will be a specification section. There will be a costing section. This is the area that I talked about earlier. When you get an invoice or you get a quote, this is where you verify that that vendor is quoting according to contract. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there can be amendments which change the pricing. So if you get a variance, you might need to, you will need to look through the amendments to see if pricing changed. But this costing area can, just like specifications, can go on for pages, which will detail exactly what you can purchase. In the event that you don't find what you're wanting in the costing sheet, please go back and reread your specs to make sure the contract covers. Okay, let's jump to the next one, please. So when we're looking at these conditions in a contract, there's certain, and these, by the way, these are simply examples of issues that we've seen, because this particular contract, again, is for security access systems. If you look at the second bullet point, this tells agency how to use the contract. So an agency can get quotes from any of the vendors on the verified vendor list. This particular contract was awarded to 4 companies. So agencies can get quotes from any of those 4. However, if the project is expected to, or the quote comes in above $25,000, $25,000 or above, then the agency must bid all of the companies. They would have to bid all 4 in this case. So essentially, this is telling you that you're allowed, if the project came in at $14,000, you can pick any one of the 4 that you want and use that contract with them exclusively. But if the project comes in at $30,000, you must bid all of the vendors. Okay, so that's one example. If we can jump to the next one, Stacy, please. Here is another example, and this is in a thing called walk-in contracts. Walk-in contracts are another huge source of doors, because agencies don't always understand exactly how they're used. So reading in the specifications, the scope of work states that this is to fulfill an immediate need of the agency. So you're working on a project, you run out of, I'm saying you're building a fence and you run out of screws. You can run down to a walk-in vendor and buy screws that are on the shelf. Let's jump down to the second paragraph, because contracts established from this bid event will be for the immediate purchase of goods. Agencies may only conduct business by physically walking into a contractor vendor's business and purchasing on-shelf supplies. This will not include any special orders or ordering extra supplies. What that means is you cannot call up the vendor and say, hey, bring me a box of screws. That's not you walking in there. It's also not to say, hey, we anticipate we're going to need 30 boxes of screws this year. Order those and I'll come pick them up. This is generally intended for small items, maintenance types of items, again, plumbing. It's a multiple use, but what's the most important part? If you walk in and they don't have it, this contract does not allow you to have them order it. Okay. And again, to the previous question, the pricing offer can be a percentage off current retail price or the retail price at the time of purchase. This is easy. You walk in, you see that box of screws is $20. You get 10% off. They should be charging you $18. But you cannot use this to pre-order supplies or have supplies delivered. Okay, walk-ins is a pretty good source of doors. Okay, next slide, please, Stacy. Okay, task orders, and many of you on this call may have received a purchase notice blast on Friday late, and that is because task orders seem to have created some confusion in the state. The blast was not addressed to any one person or any one agency. It is generic information to make sure our agencies are following task orders correctly. And you must understand the process before using the contract. In the event you don't understand it, please reach out to the procurement officer so you can set the guidelines early. Because a task order, for the most part, and we could spend 2 hours talking about that by itself, a task order is essentially a miniature bid handled by the agency. And so when we create a task order contract, OPC awards to multiple vendors who are capable of providing whatever service this event is for. So whether it be consulting, IT security, and a number of other things, we will go through, pre-vet the vendors and get all their paperwork, so the sexual harassment, BOI, etc., so agencies don't have to worry about that. However, that does not mean then the agency can just pick one and go. You've got to read the task order, and please note what I have on the screen is not generic to all task orders. This is only a representation of information that is included in a task order. So, for example, this particular one that we're looking at is from the Master Consulting Services. This is by far the largest task order that we have in the state, consisting of over 100 vendors throughout, I think, 7 categories. So within this, Section 3 of the contract states how to use this task order. And it says, the task order shall be followed for all projects that are expected to exceed $100,000. So what that essentially means, if you have a project that is going to come in less than $100,000 for the entire life of the project, you can pick a single vendor and go forth. But please note, that's not $100,000 per year. That's $100,000 for the life of the project. So if you have a 2-year project, you anticipate $60,000 spend on each year, that would require the task order process to be followed. In this case, and in most all task order cases, the agency needs to prepare a task order, which is essentially a list of requirements, much like a spec that you would create for an RFP, that it explains what you're wanting the vendor to do, any timelines, any considerations, be as clear as possible, but you must take that and then send it out to all the contractors that can provide that service. Can OPC compile a master contact list? I believe that is already done because there's 7 different categories. There should be a list out there. You can contact Bonnie Edwards. She is in charge of that, but I'm 90% certain, Kitty, that that is out there. So, and again, to Kitty's point, let's say there's 50 vendors that can provide category 2, and that's the category you're wanting. You need to send that specification to all 50. Yeah, I don't know about the contact information. Again, I would probably reach out to Bonnie and see what she has available. And so with that, you send out to all of the vendors. You receive back quotes. Depending on the total amount, it determines how long it must be published by. You also need to keep OPC in the loop. OPC needs to be aware, I am running this task order. And that task order, here's the requirements, here's who I'm sending it to. And so, because we have to advertise it, it is a bid event. Based upon the amount is how many days it must be out there. And then you will have a question and answer period. You'll reply to those. And then you will go through an award process very similar to what your PNC does for an RFP event. The agency must justify why they are documenting those. Do we have steps for how the non-awarded and awarded vendors are informed? Obviously, the awarded vendor, that's not too rough. You say, hey, you won, and but the non-awarded, it's just simply you have not been selected for that, Josh. It's just what we normally call, a recheck letter. We do not get into details. Here's why you were rejected. However, everyone please note, all of this information is subject to CORA. Yes, the Scott slides will be made available. All of this information is subject to CORA. The agency must keep copies of it. It's also a great idea to keep OPC in the loop and to provide us copies of everything as well. Because any vendor who's not awarded any vendor has the ability to submit a CORA request. And we have seen challenges on task orders, and we have seen challenges overturn a task order. So it's very important that if you're going to use a task order, read these sections, understand them, and work with the procurement officer in OPC, and we can help provide you guidance through this. Okay. So jumping to the next slide, Stacy. Cooperative contracts. I'm just going to briefly touch on these because I know we're coming up on time here. Cooperative contracts such as NASPO and Sourcewell, we use these on occasion if an event falls into one of these categories. But what I cannot stress high enough, because Sourcewell and TIPS and others are famous for telling agencies you can just go use their contract. That is not a true statement. Any cooperative contract that is allowed to be used must come from OPC. It must be approved by the director, and it must be issued a state of Kansas contract number. So there are states that say if you're a member of Sourcewell, you can use any contract, or TIPS, you can use any contract. Kansas is not one of those states. So if you have a need to use a cooperative, I ask that you email myself or a member of my team We're going to review this and we're going to ask you several questions. How much are you planning to procure? Is this useful for the entire state? And how will this assist the state? If all of this comes out well, and we do not have a competitive bid by the state, quite often we will issue what's called, we go through several steps, eventually ending up with a contract that the agency can use. Also note, we do not overlay any competitively bid state contract with the co-op. So if we bid for a particular commodity, which resulted in, 3 awards, if an agency wants to use a 4th vendor and they're available on NASPO, we will not issue that contract that competes. So the other thing, and I won't get into this in too much detail, if you have questions, please contact me, but we also have distributors. So for example, the prior contract that I showed from Dell, that allows you to purchase Dell equipment, and they have numerous vendors or distributors that sell their product. And so for that example, if you look, that is contract 55221. So any distributor, such as CDWG, SHI, and a whole truckload more, we will actually list those using an alpha character afterwards. So CDWG is 55221A, which says that using that contract number, you can order Dell equipment from CDWG. This allows you as an agency to just key in the master number on that very first slide that I showed you with the search. If you key in 55221, it will list every distributor for that product. And so if one distributor is out of that product, you can reach out to another one. So it makes it a little easier searching. All right, next slide, please, Stacy. Prior authorizations. I'm assuming most everyone is familiar with prior authorizations. However, going over these because they're another source of doors. If you start looking, a prior authorization is required when an agency is going to do a non-contract spend that is above their delegated authority. So in the current form, that's generally $5,000 per vendor per year. Prior auth must have a code on them. Prior authorizations must also explain why this is a prior auth and not a bid. So why are we not competitively bidding this particular contract? Valid cases for this are service contracts. When a particular vendor is the only one that can service a good or service. But non-valid reasons is I really like this guy, or they're really close to us, okay? That we have to have a valid reason, and this really falls into, we will reject any prior auth that section 4 is not filled out completely. This process is going to very soon, we hope by the start of the year, be moving to DocuSign. In its current event, you fill out just a PDF form, you attach it to a rec within SMART, and you send it through. The new process will actually be a true prior authorization. You will fill out a form online. Through DocuSign. It will then be routed to OPC. We will verify, and if approved, we will electronically sign it and it'll be routed back to the agency. The agency will then use that signed prior auth to attach to a requisition and route through to our office. This should save, hopefully, a lot of work. for everyone, because you'll actually have a true signed rec before you put in the entire, or I'm sorry, you'll have a signed prior authorization before entering the rec. More to follow on that. Okay, one more slide, Stacy. And here, the revised prior auth. I put this in here because in the current form under the paper, make sure you're filling out everything on the bottom if you're submitting a revised prior auth. Revised prior auths are not submitted through the SMART system. They are emailed to the procurement officer. Under the new platform with DocuSign, there will be a second form called revised prior auth, which will handle a lot of this for you. Again, the process of handling once the agency gets it back will not change. Revised prior auths do not go through SMART now. They will not go through SMART then. Jump to the next one, Stacy. And with that, I am done. I do want to mention, because there has been a couple questions about slides being made available. They are available, this presentation, on the OPC website under presentations. So once this is done, you should be able to go out and download and use these as need be. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Candace. Candace?
Kelly, just sorry, before Candace begins, there is one question. It says, training or courses offered by some of the NASPO vendors contain membership rates and non-member rates. If the state has a NASPO agreement in place, does that automatically qualify agencies for the membership rates?
Oh, thank you. So the quick answer is generally yes. Again, I'd have to look at exactly what the contract is. We are members of NASPO, and by transference, agencies are. So I'm going to say yes with a tiny bit of hesitancy because I don't know the conditions. But for the most part, Danielle, that would be yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll hand it off to Candace.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, hello all. I'm Candace Smith, the Deputy Director of Commodities and the Contract Maintenance team here over at D of A OPC. My team typically works with D of A Office of Property Management and on the new leases and amendments. To start a new lease or to create a lease amendment, you will need to reach out to Paul Fernkoff over at D of A OFPM, and he will start to walk you through the process and let you know what the steps are to get that completed. Leases and approvals need to be run through Paul Fernkoff over at D of A OFPM. All leases will need to be reviewed and approved by Department of Administration OFPM, and they should be involved in the whole process. And they will document everything, and they will send everything out for signatures and make sure everything's completed. Once Paul has completed the process with your agency, he will reach out to my group over at OPC, and we will help you set up a smart contract or update a current smart contract that you might already have for the lease. And that includes the max amounts or the expiration date. We also like to use those to attach the new amendments, or if it's a new lease, then we'll attach the new lease to that smart contract for tracking purposes. Smart contracts are strongly advised for all leases. It helps with the tracking, documentation, and payment for them. It's kind of where we keep everything currently, and it will help you with, because some leases can have 5, 6, 7 amendments, so it'll keep them all in one location. I did want to say a helpful tip is that the contract maintenance team will send out a bi-monthly report with the list of each agency's contracts that will expire within the next year. On the report that you get, there's actually a tab that's currently called Agency Grants and Contracts. That tab actually will contain any smart contract leases that you have that will be expiring within the next year. So you can definitely use that as a tool to know when some of these leases are going to be expiring. Going forward with any reports we send out, we're actually going to rename that tab so it will be easier to find. It will be called Smart Contracts, PAs, and Leases. So definitely look there, and that will help you know when you need to reach out to Paul's team and start that those new leases or amendments. And I think that's it for leases. If you guys have any questions, definitely just reach out to Candace Smith and I'll help you out. Next slide.
This is Julie Camplin, the Deputy Director of Training with the Department of Administration, Office of Procurement and Contracts. These are some useful reports. And also just a reminder for our P-card administrators, there are UMB reports available on their website as well. And if you need help running those, you can contact Tim Hund or Danny. And also, I've added some notes in here so you can tell what the difference is between, like, especially P-card vouchers deleted and P-card whole voucher deleted, so you would understand the difference there. And at the top, there's one for your non-contract spend detail. This has to be run by either one full month or by one fiscal year when you're putting in your date range. The next slide, it will have your subscriptions. To subscribe to the Smart Blast, there's a link provided, and the purchase notices. We've provided a link, and also just a reminder that the next PI meeting date is going to be December 3rd at 9 a.m. on Teams. And that's all for this office. I'll turn it back over to Office of Accounts and Reports.
Hey, Julie, can I jump in for just a second on the subscriptions? I would like to note, because we see a lot of subscriptions come through with personal email addresses, OPC requires that the email addresses come from a government agency. So any that come through with a Gmail or an Outlook or anything that appears to be personal are not approved. So we do request that anyone asking for a subscription do it from their email, their work email address. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, team. So this is Stacy, and I am going to bring us home. We are nearing the end of our time. I've got just a few reminders related to difference. What we categorized as accounting reminders, although it's important to remember that the root cause of some of these issues are not necessarily occurring in that fiscal or accounting office. The root cause might be to the data that's coming in. So it's important to keep that in mind. And again, this section is not just for the fiscal staff. It is for everybody. But for those of you that had accounting labeled errors, that's what this is focused around, is those high level details or some corrections, some quick corrections your agency might be able to make to reduce the amount of errors that we see in this category. So first things first, let's talk about expenditure account codes. These tend to be a little bit of a challenge, and we believe one root cause of that comes from a category code selection in the requisition process. So category codes are based on the global classification system for goods and services. They provide and facilitate various levels of reporting, but it's important to note that category codes and expenditure account codes are separate things. Okay. When you create the requisition, you pull in the category code, but at a certain point in the process, the accounting lines should be updated to the proper expenditure code. Okay. The expenditure codes can be found in the policy manual, and surprise, I'm not going to read it to you. So drill down to that expenditure manual that expenditure policy, and many of you know what those codes should be. But if we can correct it during that requisition and purchase order process in the accounting lines, the full process and all subsequent payments made from that that purchase order would be correct instead of relying on the fiscal office to update it with each payment. Okay. Now, one note I will make, and just so everybody has a little bit of an understanding, is there are thousands of category codes available. And unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, if we're going to tie those to expenditure codes, there are not thousands of expenditure codes. Category codes can only have a bridge or a walk to one expenditure code. So it's important to know that if we use fuel as a category code, there are multiple types of fuel when we talk about expenditure codes. So the agency will have to make the determination on which one it belongs. Are we buying airplane fuel or gasoline or otherwise? Okay. So it's important to remember those pieces. Just an idea that's come out of conversations, create a tip, like a cheat sheet for your regularly used expenditures or suppliers. If we're regularly buying seed from supplier down the road, it's code that or make a little like quick reference guide for yourself. Okay. And we recognize that there is some work to be done on the category code. So we're working on solutions to provide agencies resources to more consistently provide the expenditure account code in there. Okay. Now, let's move on to supporting documentation. Kelly went over the contract specs and cost sheets very thoroughly. It's important that when we're paying that invoice or things that we're reviewing that invoice to match the contract. That is something that's one of the first things the audit's going to do when they pull up the payment for review. Okay, so it's important that that happens all the way at the receipt of the goods or services. So whomever is responsible for receiving those in, that could be the first level of review. It certainly must be reviewed at some point, at least once, before it makes its way through the audit workflow. Oftentimes, audit opens the invoice, and when they go to match it to the contract, it's either tied to the incorrect contract entirely or the prices just don't tie out. So again, it's important that that review and tie is happening before the payment voucher makes its way to the audit workflow. A couple other reminders, the KCI waiver, if you received a KCI waiver, ensure that that is attached ideally at the purchase order level, because you should have that waiver prior to ordering chairs outside of KCI if that's the agency's need. So again, that is attached. And then this other hodgepodge of supporting documentation that may be required by the purchase or the contract. So possible task order forms, possible temporary staff approvals, and forms should be attached. Those of you that purchase two-way radios would need to have that communication letter approval attached. So again, most of you know this, the purchase that you're making and what it might require, but it's important to step back and double check that all of that information has made its way to the purchase order or the voucher, whatever is necessary, right? Again, I mentioned invoices should be reviewed upon receipt. I think that's been mentioned a couple of times throughout this discussion, but it certainly must be reviewed once. I got a little ahead of myself. And then when the vouchers are created, they must be supported by that attached invoice. Again, on I don't want to say regular basis, but we've seen enough instances to warrant a mention here where the voucher is for one amount to the supplier and the invoice is for another amount to the supplier. So it's important to make sure that the voucher that is presented for review is complete, and everything that's attached will support it for a clean review and payment. If there are situations where corrections need to be made, for example, maybe the invoice has charged the wrong amounts for the commodities we've received. First, you want to check for, is this an allowable difference? Does the contract allow for this? Is there freight charged? Is there sales tax charged? Certain questions you want to ask yourself, like what is the variance and is this allowed? That is a conversation you're going to want to have with the supplier after reviewing the contract. Are there contract amendments that weren't uploaded that should be? Again, certain things you just have to kind of go take a couple of steps back and make sure all of the information is readily available for that payment to be approved. Now, one final note I'm going to make here, and then I'm going to go over a couple of resources very quickly to get us out of here on time. But agencies really must pre-audit all vouchers. I know many of you weren't here when the Delegated Audit Authority forms were signed. If you want a copy of yours, send me a direct email and I will get you that copy right away. But in that agreement, it does require the agency to pre-audit payments, specifically payments that are less than your delegated authority, but that pre-audit should be occurring for all vouchers that are above your delegated authority. Again, Nancy mentioned this early on. It happens regularly where we receive a payment and it doesn't have an invoice. The account code is extremely incorrect. For example, I won't list examples, but the account, so there are certain things that there is no contract or purchase order or purchase authority attached in any shape or form. So those are high level key, very simple indicators that voucher should not be approved to audit's workflow and off of your workflow without correction. Okay. Again, just in anything that's above your authority is going to come through the statewide agency audit services. Okay. Now, agencies are notified via email of returned vouchers. If your agency has a centralized mailbox that should be copied on it, we recommend this if you don't. If you do have a centralized, let's say, Fisal centralized inbox to be notified, please let us know so we can make sure that is copied on payments. It will help to streamline your process internally. So if audit has to return a voucher, they can notify that inbox accordingly. Okay. Instead of now that person has been on vacation for a week and didn't see the notice and it sat there. Okay. Now, just like I said, a couple of other tips. Remember your month-end checklists and reports are available. Ensure a solid review of those month-end checklists to make sure that you've got the resources. If you can identify a resource that would be useful, please let us know. We can see if that would be an option for us to create and provide back to you. Okay. Again, review the contract spend regularly to ensure prior authorizations are not necessary. And then some other additional resources. So the SMART training is linked here. Nancy mentioned earlier, we're working to create video resources of this and update those. So be on the lookout for those coming. Don't forget your policy manuals. Again, I didn't read them to you, but they're important to know. There are catalogs of reports and inquiries out there. That is extremely useful if you're not sure what you're looking for. And then again, use those pre-audit checklists that were passed out at the CABS Summit and the identified best practices and training reminders that was issued with the agency overall error rates. If you don't have copies of those, let me know and I'll send it to you directly, but we will likely attach that to the follow-up information that will be coming out with training links and slide decks and that sort of thing. So those resources will be provided, but again, they're good key points that are regularly missed. And then as always, if there are additional questions, please feel free to email all of us. If you've got audit related questions, most of you are familiar with the AR pre-audit inbox, but certainly send us the notes or you've got the Smart Help Desk available as well. Nancy, other closing comments?
Thanks so much. I want to thank everyone for being with us. There are two quick questions left that I think we can address. One is if there are multiple invoices that make up the total of the voucher, is that okay? Or should we ask for an updated invoice to include all items?
Multiple invoices are appropriate. Just ensure that they've all been attached. They don't have to be attached as single attachments. So we have 10 attachments. They could be plugged into one attachment or I believe you can plug in multiple as well. But yes, as long as all of them are attached, audit can tie that voucher back to the invoices.
Second one, it says, is there a specific voucher amount for which DAR must review before it is finally approved? Again, tying delegated purchasing authority to delegated audit authority. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so the voucher limits are going to, the vouchers that are reviewed by the audit services are going to be those that exceed your delegated audit and or purchase authority. Delegated audit and purchase authority are, for most of you, set at that $5,000 mark or up to $5,000 mark. Anything at or above 5,000 would come through the audit workflow, or does come through the audit workflow.
Sounds great. It comes through the audit workflow until you qualify for your increased delegated purchasing authority. So
yes,
we thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to our speakers. Again, please feel free to continue to send questions to us and allow us to collaborate with you on opportunities and ways to improve and implement best practices. Thank you again. Have a great day, and we look forward to helping and assisting many of you achieve an IDPA. Take care.